On the 16th of October 1946, the remaining members of Hitler's Nazi government and hierarchy, whose actions led to the slaughter of millions of people during World War II, were led towards the gallows, where the infamous US executioner John C. Woods stood armed with the noose in his hands. The executions of the Nuremberg defendants did not go well, as they were botched, and some of the condemned took a long time to succumb to their deaths. The trapdoor was even so small that many hit their heads when they fell through, and they were left with severe bleeding head injuries as they dropped through. Death was intended to have taken place over the course of a matter of minutes, but the executioner even had to finish one of them off, pulling down on the struggling body of Julius Streicher inside of the gallows. But the execution chamber was not a purpose-built death room. It was actually a prison gymnasium. But what did this look like, as surprisingly very few images of the Nuremberg executions and also the execution chamber exist? Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The condemned Nuremberg defendants had received their death sentences weeks before on the 1st of October 1946, and there were 11 men who were sentenced to death by hanging. It was decided that the American military would be the ones who would conduct the executions, and they used the botching hangman John C. Woods to do the job. The executions were by all accounts conducted rather discreetly, and there were only a very few specific witnesses who were brought in to see the proceedings. Nuremberg Prison was where the Nazi war criminals of the Nuremberg trial were locked up. It was within the city of Nuremberg where the rallies were held by Hitler, and the city was seen as a major Nazi stronghold, but the Nuremberg trials occurred inside the Palace of Justice, which was adjacent to the prison, known as Cell Prison. But inside of the prison was a gymnasium, a rather large hall, which had been used for recreation activities for those who found themselves locked up there throughout the decades. But this room was converted to become the execution chamber, and there was a lot of building completed inside of the gymnasium following the conclusion of the trial. The Americans needed to build execution structures inside the hall that could bring the lives of the condemned Nuremberg defendants to an end, not just successfully, but swiftly. Because of this, there were gallows created inside of the room, and these were large wooden structures fitted with a number of stairs and a scaffold where the gallows beam stood on. A crossbeam stood above the trapdoor, which as mentioned was not sufficient in its size as it was too small. The result of this was that when the prisoners fell through the trapdoor, they often smashed their heads on the side and struggled to fall through correctly, and this also failed to generate the specific force and velocity needed to snap their necks. The gallows was one which executioner John C. Woods was familiar with, but there were 3 sets of these made inside of the chamber. This was to make sure that the executions went by quicker, and Woods could hang 3 men simultaneously. It was a good reason that 3 were made, as the executions at times dragged on and went a lot longer than they should have. The gallows were also surrounded by a black curtain, meaning that any witnesses could not see the wriggling and struggling of the defendants as they fell through the trapdoor, but they could hear what was happening. Regarding the execution chamber, one witness, Kingsbury Smith of the International News Service, who was invited to represent the American press, claimed that 3 black-painted wooden scaffolds stood inside the gymnasium, a room approximately 33 feet wide by 80 feet long, with plaster walls in which cracks showed. The gymnasium had only been used 3 days before by the American security guards for a basketball game. 2 gallows were used alternatively. The 3rd was a spare for use if needed. The men were hanged one at a time, but to get the executions over with quickly, the military police would bring in the man, whilst the prisoner who preceded him was still dangling at the end of the rope. The 10 once great men in Hitler's Reich, that would have lasted for 1,000 years, walked up 13 wooden steps to a platform 8 feet high, which was also 8 feet square. Ropes were suspended from a crossbeam supported on 2 posts. A new one was used for each man. When the trap was sprung, the victims dropped from sight into the interior of the scaffolding. The bottom of it was boarded up with wood on 3 sides and shielded by a dark canvas curtain on the 4th, so that no one saw the death struggles of these men dangling with broken necks. Another witness who was inside the execution chamber that day was Whitney R. Harris, a junior prosecutor who was inside of Justice Robert Jackson's team at Nuremberg. He represented Jackson at the executions, and later he wrote of the execution chamber that the executions took place in the prison gymnasium, which we will remember as a small building about 75 yards from the door leading into the cell block where the Big 21 was imprisoned. The secret that this building, which had been the workroom for the defendants who processed the thousands of affidavits submitted for the defence of the indicted organisations, and had been used for a basketball game only on the Saturday preceding, was to be the execution hall, was kept so well that only 2 security officers knew the fact on Tuesday afternoon. The members of the 4-man committee in charge of the executions were all generals: Roy v. Rickard for the United States, Patton Walsh for Britain, Morel for France, and Molkov for Russia. They handled the arrangements very efficiently, except of course for Goring's death, which could scarcely be charged to their neglect. This remains at writing the great mystery of the executions. In terms of how the executions were carried out inside of the chamber, they all followed a very similar structure and procedure. The condemned was brought into the chamber, and they had their identity confirmed, and their hands were secured behind them. They were then helped up the stairs of the gallows, and were asked to give their names and any final words. Then John C. Woods took control and secured the noose around the neck of the condemned, after placing a black cap over their heads. He then released the trapdoor when ready. It was said of Joachim von Ribbentrop's execution, the first man who was sent through the trapdoor, that at 11 minutes past 1 o'clock in the morning of the 16th of October, the white-faced Joachim von Ribbentrop stepped through the door into the execution chamber and faced the gallows on which he and the others condemned to death by the tribunal were to be hanged. Ribbentrop's hands were unmanacled and bound behind him with a leather thong. He walked by the foot of the 13 stairs leading to the gallows platform. He was asked to state his name. Flanked by 2 guards and followed by the chaplain, he slowly mounted the stairs. On the platform he saw the hangman with the noose of 13 coils, and the hangman's assistant with the black hood. He stood on the trap and his feet were bound by a webbed army belt. He was asked to state any last words and said, "God protect Germany, God have mercy on my soul. My last wish is that German unity be maintained, that understanding between East and West be realised, and there be peace for the world." The trap was sprung, and Ribbentrop died at 1:29. But the executions were not the only dose of death that the witnesses inside the execution chamber saw that morning. The most senior defendant, Hermann Goring, who was the Reichsmarshal and the second most powerful man within Nazi Germany, evaded the executioner as he took his own life in the hours before his execution. He would probably have been the first to be sent through the gallows, and it was said that Goring's body was brought into the execution chamber so that it might be viewed by the committee, and by the 2 representatives of the German people present, Dr. Wilhelm Hergner, Minister-President of Bavaria, and Dr. Jakob Meister, General Prosecutor of the High Court at Nuremberg. It was claimed by one witness that the guards carrying the stretcher set it down between the first and second gallows. Goring's big bare feet stuck out from under the bottom end of the khaki-coloured United States Army blanket. One blue silk-clad arm was hanging over the side. The colonel in charge of the proceedings ordered the blanket removed so that witnesses and Allied correspondents could see for themselves that Goring was definitely dead. The army did not want any legend to develop that Goring had managed to escape. As the blanket came off, it revealed Goring clad in black silk pyjamas with a blue jacket shirt over them, and this was soaking wet, apparently the results of efforts by prison doctors to revive him. The face of this 20th century freebooting political racketeer was still contorted with the pain of his last agonising moments and his final gesture of defiance. They covered him up quickly, and this Nazi warlord, who was like a character out of the days of the Borgia, had wallowed in blood and beauty, passed behind a canvas curtain into the black pages of history. The men of the Nuremberg executions were all executed within a couple of hours, many in a slapdash manner, by the American executioner. Woods bungled and botched much of the proceedings, but he claimed 10 men in 103 minutes, that's fast work, and he commended himself for his work. After the executions he did draw a significant amount of criticism, and responded with, "I hanged those 10 Nazis and I am proud of it. I wasn't nervous. A fellow can't afford to have nerves in this business, And I want to put a good word in for those GIs who helped me. They did swell. I'm trying to get them a promotion. The way I look at this hanging job is that someone has to do it. I got into it by accident years ago in the States. But the execution chamber of Nuremberg Gymnasium was very much after the executions returned back into a gymnasium. But this room was where many of the most high-ranking Nazis were executed at the end of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.